Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome to today's Facebook Live, which is going to be on the topic of has science killed God? Now, what this topic basically is addressing is, does science lead to atheism? Obviously it doesn't. And what's very interesting is that many academics who are even atheists, for example, philosophers of science or academic scientists who consider themselves as atheists, they would agree with theists, with us Muslims. They would say, of course, science doesn't deny God's existence. However, the reason we have to address such topics is because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes there is a distinction between academia and what's happening in the real world, what's happening in the social sphere. And it's unfortunate that some people, they assume the false assumption that science leads to atheism. And we need to unravel that. And they assume this in the conversations, in the dialogue, in the discourse with people who believe in the divine. And I think it's very, very important for us to basically make a clear distinction today, a philosophical distinction, that the assumption that science leads to atheism is absolutely false. Just like the academic and the philosopher of science and the scientist himself, Hugh Gauch, who wrote the book Scientific Method in Brief, he said that to claim that science leads to atheism is to get high marks for enthusiasm and low marks on logic, because it doesn't logically follow. Even the term itself, or the concept itself, or the statement itself that science leads to atheism, that is actually true. It's not true. So what I want to do is break this down for you. And the reason I'm going to spend some time on this is because as I'm breaking this down to you, you would learn a little bit more about the philosophy of science. You know, as many of you know, I did a postgrad in philosophy. My thesis was on an area in the philosophy of science concerning physicalism and neuroscience, and I did a specialist module called the philosophy of science, and we addressed some of these issues. So what I want to do is try to popularize some of these understandings for you to have the right concepts to be able to deal with this false assumption that is assumed by, unfortunately, many atheists online. But I have to reiterate, not all atheists believe in this, of course, and especially the academics, they do not believe that science leads to atheism, and these academics are not even theists, they're atheists themselves. So why do some people, especially online and in the popular sphere, why do some people claim that science leads to atheism? Well, they do so because they have four assumptions, okay? They have four assumptions. The first assumption is that science is the only yardstick for truth. So if they assume that science is the only yardstick for truth, and science can only address non-godly things like the physical world, they can't address a metaphysical idea like God, therefore God doesn't exist. That's a false assumption. That's the first false assumption. The second false assumption is that science works. It works. If it works, then it must be true. And this again is another false assumption, because it's based upon an assumption that is claiming that just because something works, it must be true. Well, again, this is false. And the reason this assumption helps them make the conclusion, the false conclusion, that science leads to atheism, is because if science works and it's true, and the things that it addresses is just physical things, and it can't deal with metaphysical things, generally speaking, therefore, God is not part of the equation, therefore he doesn't exist. The third assumption behind this is that science leads to certainty. And what we mean by certainty here is not well-confirmed theories or many observations, but what we mean by certainty here is absolute certainty. Frankly, science does not lead to certainty. It's one of its beauties that it doesn't lead to certainty. The other false assumption is around the topic of philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. And I'm going to explain these when I come to the point. And then I'll address some of your questions. Right. So let's go to the first false assumption. So the first false assumption behind the claim that science leads to atheism is science is the only yardstick for truth. Well, this is very problematic. Firstly, it's a self-defeating statement. Because if you're saying science is the only yardstick for truth, then, and if that statement itself is true, it should be proven. It should be proven by science. But you can't prove that statement scientifically. So if I'm making a statement, science is the only yardstick for truth, and that statement itself is supposed to be true, then we should raise the question: can you prove that statement scientifically? No. So it's a self-defeating argument from that point of view. It's a self-defeating statement or premise. Notwithstanding, let's go to why the statement itself is philosophically incoherent. Science is not the only yardstick for truth. It's beautiful and we want to use it, and science has led to amazing things, especially in medicine, but philosophically has many limitations. It's not the only yardstick for truth. For example, number one, science is limited to observation. Okay? So if you read the works of the atheist, the philosopher of science, Professor Elliot Sober, he makes a really good point in his essay called Empiricism. In actual fact, I think his essay is here. I believe it's here. Let me just double check. I think it should be here. No, it's not. It's probably in the other book somewhere else. But it's to do with the philosophy of science and epistemology and all of those things. Anyway, so Professor Elliot Sober, he basically says in his essay Empiricism, and he's a philosopher of biology, a philosopher of science, he basically says at any point in time, scientists are restricted to what they can observe. They're restricted to the limitations of their observations. In other words, and I'm paraphrasing his statement, in other words, he's basically saying that we're always going to have a limited number of observations. We're never going to have the total number of observations for a particular phenomenon. We're never going to have an infinite number of observations. So from that point of view, if at any particular moment in time, science and scientists are limited to the observations at hand, then it follows there may be another observation that can be at odds with your current conclusions. It could be at odds with your current conclusions. So therefore, the thing that you consider the truth may not be true, because you may have another observation or another perspective that you haven't observed or seen or acquired that can contradict your previous conclusions. So it has limitations. So you can't say it's the only yardstick for truth. Significantly, science is limited because it is morally neutral. Many people basically say that science is amoral. That doesn't mean it's immoral. Amoral means it can't really address the foundations for morality from a point of view of addressing that morals are objective in nature. They're outside of the limited human mind and limited human emotions from that point of view. So science is morally neutral from that point of view. Science can tell you what is going on, but it can't really tell you what ought to happen. Let me give an example. If a scientist basically, forget scientists, say you have this thought experiment. Someone basically says to you, there was a human being, he picked up a knife and he was cutting the chest of another human being. Is that morally good or morally bad? Well, intuitively, many people may think, well, that's morally bad. But we need more information. We need more moral variables. We need the context behind what's going on. It's only morally bad based upon intention and context, because it could be a surgeon that is performing life-saving surgery. So from that point of view, cutting someone's chest open is morally good. However, if, for instance, someone is cutting someone's chest because they want to murder that person, then that is morally bad. Technically speaking, science can only tell you what is going on. There is a knife, it's penetrating some flesh, the flesh is being torn open or ripped open, and there's bleeding and all the biology behind it, right? So science can tell you what is actually happening, but science can't tell you if that really is a good thing or not. You need some other information. You need some, maybe moral intuitions or some, a philosophical framework behind your moral theory, normative ethical theory, or maybe you have to adopt a certain medical ethical paradigm, or whatever the case may be. So generally speaking, science can tell you what is going on, but doesn't necessarily tell you what should happen. Don't get me wrong, science can inform us about things concerning pain and pleasure, which could inform us about someone's well-being. And generally speaking, we can use well-being as part of a greater picture to form maybe some ethical rules, for instance, right? Because, you know, you shouldn't harm people, and someone who's being harmed doesn't have well-being, and well-being can be somehow, you know, indicated with some kind of scientific evidence. It's not the only evidence, but it's part of the greater set of evidence that we have to make ethical conclusions. But the main point I want to say here is that science can't tell us if something is objectively morally wrong. Why? And obviously this is based on the assumption that you consider morals to be objective, but that's a different discussion maybe next week. But say we take the axiom, the first principle, that some morals are objective, they're outside of the human mind and limited emotions, then they require some kind of philosophical grounding. You know, why are they objective and where did they come from? Now science can't address that, because all science can do really is provide a subjective basis for morals, not an objective basis. But if morals are objective and we take that first principle, then science can't really provide the grounding for objective morals. It can't tell us why that moral value or truth is actually objective and where it came from. Because generally speaking, if you take, for example, biology, for example, if our morals are the things that we consider to be objective values, they came as a result of biology, then they're subject to inevitable biological changes. They're not objective anymore. Also, they lose any moral meaning because according to Darwinian mechanism or biology, for example, our morals are a result of a rearing of biological conditions. For example, even Charles Darwin, he gave a really extreme example. He basically said that if we were to be reared under precisely the same conditions as the hive bees, we would think it's okay to kill our brothers and I think kill our fertile daughters from that point of view. Now, if you extend this further, you will understand that, you know, if we were to be reared biologically under precisely the same conditions as the nurse shark, we would think it's okay to rape women, because that's what the nurse shark does. It rapes its mate. It bites the fin of its mate and it wrestles its mate. So science can't give you a foundation for objective morals from that point of view. So therefore, it's morally neutral or amoral from that point of view. Also, science can't delve into the personal. Science can't delve into the personal. What do I mean by the personal here? So that's another limitation. That's why science is not the only yardstick for truth, because it has limitations. Another limitation we're talking about is science can't delve into the personal. Let me give you an example. Science can't really tell us about inner subjective conscious experiences. This is known as the hard problem of consciousness. Why? What is it like to have an inner subjective conscious experience? So, you know, what is it like to have an inner subjective conscious experience? Where does that experience come from? Can we explain that inner subjective conscious experience just by reference to physical processes in the brain, to neurobiology? These are big questions in consciousness. These are big questions in neuroscience. But generally speaking, science can't answer the question, because science is what you would call, as Professor Thomas Nagel said, third person. It deals with third person facts. But inner subjective conscious experiences are first person facts. The two methods are totally different from that point of view. And this is a much lengthier discussion which I'll address in forthcoming Facebook Lives concerning the hard problem of consciousness, and if science is equipped, or if neuroscience is equipped to deal with the hard problem. I did my postgrad thesis on this, and the conclusion was, like many other philosophers, that no, science, or particularly neuroscience, can't deal with the hard problem of consciousness. Why? Because fundamentally, neuroscience is based on a philosophical assumption called physicalism, which basically means that everything can be reduced to physical processes. So neuroscience assumes that neurochemical activity is identical to inner subjective conscious states. But that's an assumption that requires philosophical thinking. Science itself can't deal with it, can't really tell us what it's like for a particular individual to have an inner subjective conscious state, and why that inner subjective conscious state arises from neurobiological happenings, okay? So science can't deal with the personal. The next limitation, which helps us answer why science is not the only yardstick for truth, is that science cannot answer why things happen, right? Imagine my auntie, for example, she baked a cake for us, okay? A really nice cake. So my auntie, she baked a really nice cake. And my auntie is a really good cook. Alhamdulillah. So she baked for us a cake and she gave it to us. but she didn't say anything, and then she walked away. If I asked you the question why she baked the cake, you would never know. Because it's based on something personal and based on intention. But if I asked you how she baked the cake, now without even asking her, based upon the cake itself, you could do some science and whatever the case may be and do some tests, and you could understand how the cake was made just by testing the empirical reality. But to understand her intentions and the why, which means having a purpose, is not really a scientific discussion. Science tells you the how, it doesn't really tell you the purpose or the why. And a lot of people, they always conflate the two. Just because you know the how, it doesn't mean you know the purpose or the why. It's a logical fallacy. So another issue is that science is not the only yardstick for truth, because there are other sources of knowledge. This is well known in Western epistemology, even in Eastern epistemology, if there is such a thing, right? So in the study of the sources of knowledge, it is well known there are other sources of knowledge. It's not only memory or only empirical stuff. There are also other things like testimony. I remember I had a debate with Professor Lawrence Krauss many, many years ago, and yes, of course, I've done many mistakes, and if I were to turn back time, I'll fix some of the mistakes during the debate as well, but we're all learning. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise being to the Lord, right? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the loving and the merciful and the wise, right? So anyway, during that debate, I spoke to Professor Lawrence Krauss. It's one of the highlights of the debate in my view. And I said to him, hey, you have a metaphysical presupposition. You have a metaphysical presupposition. And that metaphysical presupposition is that you think truth is as a result of you experiencing things or testing things, if I remember correctly. And he said, yeah, I'm a scientist. I said, yeah, but there are other sources of knowledge. And he said, like what? What sources of knowledge? And I said, well, like testimony. And he almost sniggered at me. And I said, well, listen to this. Do you believe in evolution? He said, yes. Yes, I do believe in evolution. I do the science. I said, fine. But have you done all the science yourself? Have you done all the experiments yourself? He said, no. And people started to laugh at him because it exposed that there was another source of knowledge that he was relying on. And that source of knowledge was testimony, the say-so of other scientists. Now, I'm going to address this in forthcoming Facebook Lives about testimony itself and the epistemology of testimony, which is a revived discussion in the past 30 or 40 years in Western philosophy. So, science is not the only yardstick for truth because you have other sources of knowledge. Now, what's really damning as well to this assumption, this false assumption, is that science cannot prove necessary truths. Think about that. Science cannot prove necessary truth, and you need necessary truths like mathematics, for example, or logic, 1 + 1 = 2, before you have science. So the false assumption here that some people have, not all people, that science is the only yardstick for truth is absolutely false, because you have to deny deductive logic, and you have to deny necessary truths, and you have to deny mathematics itself. Let me give you an example. Here's a necessary truth from a deductive point of view. Here's a deductive argument. Number 1, all bachelors are unmarried men. Number 2, John is a bachelor. Number 3, therefore John is an unmarried man. Now this, what you call in the language of logic, if you like, this conclusion necessarily follows, because the conclusion is, the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. It's a valid argument because it necessarily follows, the conclusion necessarily follows, and it's a sound deductive argument because we have no reason to reject the premises. So all bachelors by definition are unmarried men. John is telling us he's a bachelor, therefore John is an unmarried man. This necessarily follows. It's valid and it's sound. Now, why can't science prove necessary truths like logic and mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2, or deductive arguments, conclusions that necessarily follow? Why can't science deal with this? Because if you look at the logical relations between the logical properties of the deductive argument, the logical relations can't be proven scientifically, because we know there is a logical relation between bachelors, unmarried, men, John, and bachelor. Now, the logical relation is not just based upon the definitions. We also believe that the conclusion is true based upon the logical relations between the logical properties. And the logical properties in this case are terms like bachelor, unmarried, men, John, and bachelor. There is a logical relation between these. Science can't deal with these logical relations. There's a really good book by Professor Lawrence Bonjour who addresses this issue, that this is an a priori truth, meaning these logical relations are true before any experience. They are true before any experience. Okay, so this is very important to understand. So science can't deal with necessary truths. You need them before you do any science. So that's the first main assumption dealt with. The second main assumption is, well, science works, right? It works. Look, man, keyhole therapy, no, keyhole surgery, not therapy. You know, I don't know, heart transplant, lung transplant, now face transplant, maybe there's going to be a brain transplant, who knows? Science is beautiful, and that's why historically, Islamically, you know, Islam was in love with science. There was a symbiotic relationship between, you know, science and Islam from that point of view, because science is ethics and its values and its models, you know, in terms of the way it has a conception for the good life, promoted, you know, looking into the horizons and investigating ourselves and the wonders external to ourselves, right? So science works and we love it. So, but people have the false assumption that just because it works, therefore it must be true. And therefore if it's true, and science doesn't really deal with the God question directly because God is a metaphysical concept, he's outside of the universe, therefore God doesn't exist. This is a false assumption. Let me give an example. If someone studies the philosophy of science, they will know that workable theories that seem to be true and that were working became false eventually. Take the theory of phlogiston. The theory of phlogiston was, you know, it existed in the 1700s, and it basically argued that things that were combustible, things that would burn, they would release phlogisticated air. And this was a workable theory. It was workable to the point where Dan Rutherford in 1772, he used this theory to basically discover nitrogen. There you go, he discovered nitrogen. And later on they found out that phlogiston was false. So what do we learn from this? That we can get a truth like nitrogen coming from a workable theory that was eventually shown to be false. There you go. And what's interesting, if you buy the book Philosophy of Science, a very short introduction, it's very, very short, but it's a really good book to read as a really good summary. The academic Samir Okasha, he says, historically there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false, but were empirically quite successful. Also, Professor Elliot Sober, who is an atheist and a philosopher of science and a philosophy of biology, he says false models can sometimes work better than true ones. So that's the second assumption dealt with. Third assumption. The third assumption to the false claim that science leads to atheism is that science leads to certainty, absolute certainty in this context. Well, this is not true. The beauty of science is that it doesn't lead to certainty. That's the beauty. It's always moving forward. It's always progressing. It's always making us understand, you know, the world in different ways, in ways that are maybe closer to the truth. Now, the first reason why it doesn't lead to certainty is, well, well-confirmed scientific theories can change, even if people adopt realism, scientific realism. So here's an example. In the philosophy of science, there's a discussion between the realists and the anti-realists, generally speaking. You have the instrumentalists as well, but let's talk about the two main camps. You have the realists and the anti-realists. The realists say that well-confirmed scientific theories are a representation of the state of affairs, meaning they equal to truth. The anti-realists say no, well-confirmed scientific theories are not a representation of the state of affairs. They are approximations of the state of affairs. And they've had this debate for quite a long time, but they both conclude now, even if we believe that well-confirmed theories are equal to truth, they can still change. So there's no absolutes there. And you could study this for yourself, by the way. Okay, guys? Now, one of the main reasons science doesn't lead to certainty in an absolute way, which is one of its beauties, I believe, is because of the problem of induction. Science basically relies on induction. What is induction? Induction basically says that you have limited observations and you conclude for an unknown. So, for example, I've observed 1,000 white sheep and I make the conclusion, therefore, all sheep are white. Or the next observation is going to be a white sheep. Now, you may argue you have good evidence for this because you've observed so many white sheep, but it doesn't necessarily follow. It's an inference. It's an inductive inference. You don't basically have an infinite number of observations. The next observation can contradict your previous conclusions. So I want you to listen to this principle, which would always make you understand this. there can always be a new observation that can be at odds with our conclusions based on previous limited data. I repeat, just keep on understanding this point. This is well known in the philosophy of science. This is basic stuff, right? There can always be a new observation that can be at odds with our conclusions based on previous limited data. As Gillian Barker and Philip Kitcher said in their book Philosophy of Science, a New Introduction, published by Oxford, they said, science is revisable, hence to talk of scientific proof is dangerous because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. Now, I want a note on falsification here. Now, I wrote an essay that you can find on my academia profile. If you go to, I think it's called academia.edu/a.tzortzis. There's an essay on Popper and his view on the scientific method. Now, Popper understood that there was a problem with induction, that science doesn't lead to certainty, and he basically came up with the idea of falsification, which basically means he was saying that you can't prove scientific theories to be true. You can't prove scientific theories to be true, but you can prove them to be false. This was the Popperian understanding of science, okay? And why did he say this? Because he said, if a theory claims that something will be observed under certain circumstances, and it is not observed, then the theory is proved false. For example, here's a theory. All birds that die on Friday will do so in mid-flight. How do you falsify this theory? Well, you just observe a bird that died on Friday, that wasn't flying. It denies my theory. It falsifies my theory, okay? Now, but the interesting thing here is, it's a very shallow view to think that if a theory has been falsified, it means it's wrong. So Popper was right. You can't absolutely prove theories to be true. So he said, well, we could prove them to be false. Absolutely. That's wrong. Popper was wrong here. And this is known in academia. He's right to a practical sense, but he's wrong. Because in falsified theories, you can revive falsified theories if you change the auxiliary assumptions. If you change the auxiliary assumptions. And I suggest you read that paper that I wrote. I'll give an example. Take, for example, the existence of Neptune. Neptune was discovered because of the wobbly orbit of Uranus. So the data that we were observing of Uranus was a bit of a wobbly oblet. What's an oblet? It was a wobbly orbit, okay? And that wobbly orbit, brothers and sisters and friends, denied the theory of what was going on before, our understanding of orbits. But the scientists didn't use that to falsify the theory. What they did, they used it to make them investigate about the assumptions that they were having. And the assumptions were that they thought they had all the planets observed. But if they had the other assumption of maybe there is another planet, and that's affecting the orbit of Uranus, then it makes sense. And it eventually helped them discover Neptune itself. So falsified theories can be revived if you change the auxiliary assumptions. And we have this precedent in the philosophy of science when and just search it up when you study the existence of Neptune and how they discovered Neptune. Again, Samit Okasha says, and this is very interesting to say, pick virtually any scientific discipline you like, and you can be sure that the prevalent theories in that discipline will be very different from those 50 years ago and extremely different from 100 years ago. Now, one would argue here, okay, now we're done. So that's the third assumption. Now the fourth and final assumption before we go into question and answers is about philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. So the claim that science leads to atheism is false because one of the false assumptions is that some people who make this claim, they assume, and listen very carefully, they assume a non-scientific philosophical assumption called philosophical naturalism. What is philosophical naturalism? It's the worldview, it's the lenses that someone puts on their face in order to understand the world. It's the lenses that someone puts on their face in order to understand the world. So they start it as a first principle. And philosophical naturalism says that there is no divine, no supernatural, everything could be explained by physical processes. They already assume that. If you assume that, then no matter what you see in the real world, you're always going to agree with your previous assumption, because that's the thing that you're first seeing through. This is how you understand the world. You already made the claim without any evidence. It's your philosophical position that there's no divine, no supernatural, everything can be explained by physical processes. If that's the case, then you'll never see the divine from that point of view. You'll be blinded from that point of view. And even the atheist, the professor of philosophy, Professor Michael Rules, he says, if you want a concession, I've always said that naturalism, in this case philosophical naturalism, is an act of faith. So people who make the claim that science leads to atheism, they adopt a non-scientific philosophical assumption called philosophical naturalism. Also, what they do is they misunderstand methodological naturalism. They think methodological naturalism is the same as philosophical naturalism. They conflate the two. Why is that the case? Because generally speaking, scientific conclusions are based on something called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism basically says for any scientific theory to be scientific, okay, for any scientific theory to be scientific, it cannot refer to God's power or God's creativity. It doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It's just for things to be scientific, you can't refer to God's power or God's creativity. You can only refer to physical causes. Fair enough. Even Islamically, it's not a problem. You could be a methodological naturalist. You could say, right, these are the physical causes that God has used to manifest his divine power. No problem. And we don't have to mention his divine power in the scientific theory or conclusion. Not a problem. But because scientific theories don't refer to God's existence because they adopt methodological naturalism, then people make the false assumption, therefore God doesn't exist. But that assumption now, you're conflating methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. And that is the problem. And that is the big problem, because methodological naturalism is not a philosophical worldview. It's just a practical perspective on scientific conclusions that make us understand science in a way that is progressive and in a way that gives us good answers, which basically says, do your science, you can believe in God, but when you do your science, don't refer to divine activity or creative power. And that, generally speaking, is not a problem for Muslims, because we believe that the physical universe is a manifestation of God's divine activity and power. That's not a problem. So what they do is they conflate the two. They think just because science doesn't refer to divine activity or creative power, therefore he doesn't exist. No. And this is why the evolutionary biologist Scott C. Todd, he said, of course the scientist as an individual is free to embrace a reality that transcends naturalism, meaning in this case, methodological naturalism. Also, another problem is that people think just because science tells us the how, we think there is no why. That's a false assumption as well. Because yes, science can tell you the how, but it doesn't really tell you the why or the purpose behind something. And just because you know more of the how, it doesn't mean now there's no need for the why. Okay? So, science does not lead to atheism. It's a false perspective. Even atheist academics don't agree with this, but unfortunately some popularizers have this assumption. And as we said, science cannot observe God from that point of view. Science can only deal with observations. God, by definition, laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing like unto him. Is that outside of the universe? He's metaphysical from that point of view. Therefore, science can only stay silent on the topic. Yeah. Also, there are other sources of knowledge. We shouldn't conflate between methodological and philosophical naturalism. Explaining how things work do not disprove that they have a creator. And remember what I said in the beginning, that the statement that science leads to atheism is based on 4 false assumptions. Number 1, that science is the only yardstick for truth, which is not true. We've broken that down. The other false assumption is, number 2, that science works, therefore its conclusions must be true. Again, that's a false assumption. Number 3, the third false assumption is that science leads to absolute certainty, which again is not true, as we just discussed. And the fourth and final false assumption is the misunderstanding of philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. So we've addressed the 4 false assumptions that give a basis to the claim that science leads to atheism. We've broken that claim, and I go back to the beginning quote that I mentioned from the philosopher of science and the scientist himself, Hugh Gauch, in his book Scientific Method in Brief, when he said that to claim that science leads to atheism is to get high marks for enthusiasm and low marks for logic. So, there you go. I think we have, inshallah, God willing, solved the problem. But I think more important questions arise, brothers and sisters and friends, which is, number 1, has science made God irrelevant? I got this from Mr. Cumberland, I think his name is, from Twitter. Thank you very much, sir. It's a very good point. Has science made God irrelevant, right? Or has science made religion irrelevant? But these main questions I'm going to address in another Facebook Live, God willing. But let's stick to the topic that we just mentioned. So, any questions? Any questions? By the way, if anyone's from Southampton area, South England, I'm giving this lecture tomorrow at the University of Southampton, inshallah, God willing. So, do we have any questions? Well, I'm always really bad at dealing with these questions, so I do apologize. 1 second. Just scrolling down. Oops. 1 second. So I'm just scrolling down. Some of the questions don't really apply to what we're talking about, okay? I don't know why you guys have a debate when someone's talking. Just, just have some, have some, what you call in Islam, adab. Adab is like, a good ethic. When someone's trying to portray an argument or position, he may be wrong, I may be wrong, fair enough. But at least have, the kind of ethical stance of listening before you guys debate, and you miss everything that someone has to say. And no wonder the whole online world is full of misconceptions, misrepresentations. We should listen with the intention to understand. Honestly, guys, come on. Everyone's having like a crazy debate here. Anyway, so 1 second. And I don't know why you guys are bringing up Stephen Hawking. This is irrelevant to the discussion. Okay, let me. Any questions, guys? Because I can't really find any questions. Julie Hitchery said, "I want to try keyhole therapy." Yeah, I meant keyhole surgery. I do apologize. 1 second. Chad Start says, "Weird how these are the same arguments that different religions use for God, different gods." I agree, but this is not an argument for God, so it's a misplaced comment. Valid comment, but it's a misplaced comment in this context. I'm not trying to prove a God's existence here. What I'm saying is that science doesn't lead to atheism, so your comment doesn't really address what we talked about today. We could address your comment. Let's try and find questions that are really dealing with the topic itself. This is a really good question. Dr. Richard, this is from Tanima Mim Hussein. Okay, we're back on. Sorry, the internet cut off. So, a question by Tanima Mim Hussein. She says, Dr. Richard Dawkins argues it's up to us to find our own values in life, but what aids us in knowing the meaning of value in and of itself? This is a really good point. Now, I don't know if he said that, so I don't want to directly address him. I have no idea if he said it or not. But let's just use this question as a wider question. What is value? This is a very important point. Value, according to a philosophical naturalist, is quite problematic. Now, if someone is an atheist and a philosophical naturalist, and they're not always the same, but say they adopt philosophical naturalism that everything can be explained by physical processes, then we have a huge problem when it comes to value, because value just becomes subjective. There's nothing ultimate about value, even about human life. Now, don't get me wrong, people can believe what they want, but I'm just talking to you about the philosophical implications of just believing that this whole universe just can be explained by physical processes. That is a very problematic view. And I mentioned this in my book when I talk about the implications of God, of not believing in God. And I talk about value. So take, for example, we all have the first principle that we ultimately value life, which means that the value of life is objective. It's not based on my limited mind or emotions or my limited psychological perspective. It's outside, so to speak, right? Now, how can we ground that with physical stuff and physical processes? How can we say as the atheist philosophical naturalist says that everything can be explained by physical processes, how can we justify our sense of ultimate value with that worldview? You can't. I'm sorry. Because physical processes are fundamentally what? They don't have any intrinsic value. You know, electrons whizzing around don't have any intrinsic value. So why am I more valuable, for example, than a broken chair? It's still a different rearrangement of physical stuff, which has no intrinsic value, which can be further reduced to electrons just whizzing around. So I find that very, very problematic to even try and justify our sense of ultimate value, even ultimate value for human life, under atheistic philosophical naturalism, which is the view that things can be reduced to physical processes. I find it very problematic. Now you may say, yeah, but you have a mind, you have a consciousness. Yeah, but what does that mean according to philosophical naturalism? It basically means that it's just reduced to physical stuff, physical processes which don't have any intrinsic value, which are further reduced to electrons whizzing around. Well, you may argue, yeah, but you're more complex, and complexness give us good things. Yeah, but what do those concepts mean? They're reduced to firings in your brain, which are further reduced to physical processes, which are further reduced to electrons whizzing around, which have no intrinsic value. I'm sorry, we can't have our cake and eat it. If we adopt philosophical naturalism, we can't really justify our first principle, our sense of ultimate value for human life, based on philosophical naturalism. You could justify it spiritually, religiously, and otherwise, or even intuitively, but to claim that philosophical naturalism can justify our sense of ultimate value is absolutely false. I'm sorry. I mean, what's the difference between myself and the bacteria on a dead rat? According to philosophical naturalism, not much really. It's just a different arrangement of physical processes interacting in different ways that could be further reduced to electrons whizzing around, which have no intrinsic value. So I'm sorry, we can't have our cake and eat it. So the logical implications of this worldview are that you can't justify the very things that make you human. So I think we're done. Or actually, let me see if there's any more questions. Let me just scroll all the way down. Bear with me. Sorry for the fingers. 1 second. 1 second. So many questions. By the way, this video is going to be on my Facebook page. If you found the presentation useful, please share it. You could take it, put it up on YouTube, put it on your channels, do what you want. There's no copyright, no intellectual copyright. If this is useful, just take it and do what you want, okay? 1 second. Mohammed Owais, behave, bro. Those comments are not helpful. 1 second. Barcelona are winning. Well done, Mohsin. Mohsin, how's Slough, bro? Yeah, behave, okay? You're not supposed to be watching football if you're watching this, yeah? May Allah bless you. Okay, 1 second. Anything else? So I'm trying to get some questions. It's very hard on my phone, so I do apologize. This is very good. So Tamim Farouk, very good point. He says, how would you respond to the one who claims that we can become content with creating our own purpose and value, assuming no objective value exists? Well, you know what? Everyone has a right. Everyone has a right to try and, understand some kind of value, okay, for their life and a purpose for their life and some type of meaning. One professor said that, we should engage in meaningful activity in our lives, so that meaningful activity could be a barrier and a buffer against the existential angst that we suffer from as a result of our mortality. I thought that was very deep. Because if you engage in meaningful things, then you forget about, the depression of that your life is not going to last forever. Look, philosophically, so emotionally people could do what they want, right? Let them make things up for their lives, right? You can't force anyone to have your perspective, However, philosophically, it's incoherent, I think. Because if we claim that there is no ultimate purpose for our life, but then we start to attribute purpose for our own existence in a subjective way based on limited minds and emotions, for me, that would be equivalent of children when they play. If you see them play at school and nursery, in kindergarten, they pretend to be like doctors and nurses. They say, let's pretend to be doctors and nurses. ultimately they're not doctors and nurses, but they pretend to be doctors and nurses. Likewise, if you believe there's no ultimate purpose for your own existence, but yet you attribute some purpose for your own little life in a subjective way, it is no different from saying, let's pretend to have purpose. And from a philosophical point of view, I don't find that appealing. I don't find it appealing. Now, this idea comes from a kind of French existential understanding. I think it was from from Sartre, who talked about nothingness. And intrinsically, some of the existentialists, they basically said that life itself is intrinsically meaningless. We only attribute meaning. So they said to empower yourself, fundamentally understand that nothing has meaning, but things can have meaning if you decide and choose to have meaning for your life and for things. And that would therefore give you a new realm of possibility to have different meanings for your life. But I find that still problematic philosophically, because if fundamentally there is no meaning for anything, you giving yourself meaning is like a contradiction, because how can meaning come from no meaning? Then you may think, oh, but it's subjective meaning. There's no objective meaning, but you can have subjective meaning. Yeah, but I find that problematic too. I don't find that coherent. I find it psychologically problematic, because I think what drives the human being is a sense of meaning. You know, because what does meaning mean? It essentially means closer to the truth. That's what it really means. It's meaningful, meaning it's true, or it's close to truth. And it has some kind of value outside of yourself, outside of your limited perspectives. It's not subject to your limitations, to your limited minds and emotions. And you may argue, well, Hamza, get over it. Yeah, just get over it. Well, fine. I'm not saying it's a problem. I just find it problematic philosophically to argue that you have no meaning and purpose for your life, but you attribute to your life. For me, it's just like kids playing in a playground saying, I'm a doctor and I'm a nurse. It's like we're playing with life. And intuitively, you know that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So, next question. By the way, I could be wrong. These are my musings. 1 second. Oh, this is an interesting point. So Claire Pale says, basically trying to prove God through science, which go hand in hand with methodological naturalism, is like trying to find some wood with a metal detector. That's very interesting. I'm not a fan of using science to prove God's existence at all, to be honest. Because as we just discussed today, science can basically be silent on the topic, or it may give you some evidence you can make an inference. But that inference ends up being a philosophical discussion, not really a scientific one. So I would actually agree with Claire. Okay, a few more questions, bear with me. Okay, 1 second. Just bear with me. Well, that's it really. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. So, Jazakallah khair. You know, may Allah bless you guys. I'm trying to look for, I think more questions are coming. What is rationality from the view of science and the problems with it? Oh, that's a big topic. I did that for my postgrad as well. Well, essentially, as I said in the presentation today, that science can't deal with necessary truths like mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2, or deductive arguments, valid arguments in sound deductive logic. Science can't justify that. And I said in a deductive argument, there are logical relations in the logical properties in the argument itself, or in the premises that lead to the conclusion. Now, those logical relations you can't prove empirically at all. It's game over. Game over. And that's why in rationality, if you include logic, right, and the ability to reason logically, logical reasoning, well, science is dead. From that point of view, you can't really justify, logical relations and properties. And a really good philosopher who addresses this is Professor Lawrence Bonjour. So, take this video, guys, share it. I think a lot of students need this video, because the philosophy of science is not really addressed or understood very well, especially amongst scientists sometimes, or people who study the topic, and even amongst some of our, and I'm saying this with humility, some of our more learned Muslim activists and scholars, sometimes they jump onto the science bandwagon without understanding science, and they make some ridiculous claims that how science could inform some kind of metaphysical truths and theological truths, which is extremely problematic. And they equate epistemologies that are not on the same level, like God's knowledge with human knowledge. Allah, God has the picture, we just got the pixel. So for us to basically try and equate human limited knowledge with concepts like, I don't know, predestination or qadar or God's knowledge and stuff like that, I think is extremely problematic. I'm not saying they shouldn't think. Of course, everyone has a right to think, but they should understand the epistemology, and this is a huge problem. This is a huge problem. We need to be very, very careful and understand the scope of science and the scope of other forms of reasoning. It's extremely dangerous. I'm hearing people starting to get some science that is not even conclusive, and trying to understand key theological concepts that you have to have as part of your creed from an Islamic perspective. And for me, that shows a gross ignorance of Islamic philosophy, Islamic thought, and Islamic creed, and a gross ignorance of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I find it very problematic. My advice would be let's go back to basics. Let's go read just read a basic book on the philosophy of science. I've got one here actually, by Alex Rosenberg. He's a atheist himself, right? Philosophy of science goes through induction. Goes through the problem of induction. Goes through naturalism. Goes through induction and probability. Goes through confirmation, falsification, and underdetermination. It goes through all of these things. It's basic stuff. I think I should have other stuff here somewhere. It's not. There's more books over there. So there's lots of books over there as well, which I might go and just pick some books just to show you. Actually, I will. Just bear with me. Bear with me. Actually, let me take this phone with me, yeah? Let's do this. This is not my personal library, by the way. Although most of the books are probably mine, but this is not my personal library. This is the office. So let's go for a little walk, okay? Mind the mess. I'm going to clean up here. So let's see. Right, what do we have here? There should be stuff here concerning the topic I just spoke about. It's not in any orderly fashion, unfortunately. But it should be here somewhere. Wrong place. Just bear with me, guys, okay? Just bear with me. So, yeah, here you go. So you got Philosophy of Biology. Okay, this is by Elliot Sober, Professor Elliot Sober. You have, this is a really good book actually, Conceptual Issues in Evolutionary Biology by, again, Elliot Sober, 3rd edition. You have, what else do we have? There's so many here, so I have to filter through all of them. This is actually an interesting book. It's called The Oxford Handbook to the Philosophy of Emotion. Right. If you're interested in stuff like that. Just bear with me. Again, that's it. Gillian Barker and Philip Kitcher, the one I quoted to you. The Philosophy of Science, A New Introduction. Get these books and really solve all your problems as Muslims and theists. When you think all of a sudden, science is like denying religion or contradicts religion, and therefore there's no reconciliation or no hope for trying to understand both of them, or that God doesn't exist now, and it questions theism. It doesn't. People just have a gross ignorance of the philosophy of science, honestly. Let me see if there's any other books for me to share with you. Just bear with me. This is a good one, I think. This is called The Philosophy of Biology by Peter Godfrey Smith. Actually, Peter Godfrey Smith is really good. He's written some really good stuff concerning the philosophy of science. I know it's a bit dark. I do apologize. Anyway, that should start you off. That should start you off for now. May Allah bless you guys. Do apologize for the mess and stuff like that. Anyway, so keep on reading. May Allah bless you all. Who bought all of those books? Well, I bought